Welcome to another verse-by-verse teaching through the Bible. We're now in Genesis chapter 25, and this is the chapter that lists the last part of Abraham's life. The story about Abraham began in Genesis chapter 12, and so here we are in Genesis 25. So a large portion of Genesis is devoted to Abraham and his story, and this chapter is where he took a second wife. This is after his wife Sarah died. Sarah died when she was 127 years old, or when Isaac was 36 years old. Abraham was 136 years old at this time. And then Abraham lived to be 175 years old. So based on all of these things, and again, if you were to get my living commentary, I think you could understand this better. I've got charts and things in there and a lot of verses that show this, but because of the listing of, here in Genesis chapter 25 and verse 20, it says Isaac was 40 years old when he took Rebekah to wife, and Abraham was 100 years old when he was born. So we suppose that when he married this Keturah, that it was probably, he was 140-something years old, and he still had 6 more sons. That's not including the daughters. So when God healed Abraham, he healed Abraham. He kept having children into his 150s and maybe even longer than that. So in Genesis chapter 25, verse 1, it says, "Then again Abraham took a wife, and her name was Keturah." So this was after the death of Sarah, "and she bare him," and here I go with these names again, but praise God, I don't believe you can pronounce them any better than I can. So anyway, here we go. "She bare him Zimram, and Joshan, and Medan, and Midian, and Ishbak, and Shua. And Jokshan begat Sheba and Dedan, and the sons of Dedan were Ashurim and Lethuim, and I don't even have a clue how to pronounce that one. But anyway, those were the sons of Jokshan. And verse 4, it says, "And the sons of Midian, Ephah, and Epher, and Hanok, and Abiah, and Eldah, and all these were the children of Keturah." So these were the children of this second wife that Abraham took after the death of Sarah. And so Sarah died, I think, when Isaac was 36 years old, and he was 40 years old, and he was married, and then this is after that. And so it was at least 4 years after the death of Sarah, and possibly longer than that before Abraham married Keturah. And you know, this is amazing to think that Abraham lived with Sarah probably for 100 years. And so the previous chapter talked about the death of Sarah and him getting a burying place for her. But man, to live with a woman for 100 years, that's quite an accomplishment. In verse 5, it says, "And Abraham gave all that he had unto Isaac, but unto the sons of the concubines which Abraham had, Abraham gave gifts and sent them away from Isaac his son while he yet lived eastward into the east country." And so I mentioned this earlier when I was talking about Hagar leaving with Ishmael, and it said that Abraham just gave her some bread and some water and sent them away. And yet here he gave all of his concubines and all of their children multiple gifts and things to take care of them. I believe he provided for them because he's the one that fathered the children. And so I suspect that he probably did that with Hagar and Ishmael also. In verse 7 it says, "And these are the days of the years of Abraham's life, which he lived 160 years." So that means that he was 175 years old when he died, or it was 39 years after Sarah's death. Abraham was 160 years old when Esau and Jacob were born, and Shem, the son of Noah, outlived Abraham by 35 years. And so I have this age chart. You know, we've got a printout of this, and if you get my living commentary, you'll have this in the digital format. But this is really awesome because it shows, here's Adam's life, and it shows you that Adam lived all the way down here. Noah could have visited with Enos, the third from Adam, and stuff. And then it shows, here's Abraham way down here, and Abraham actually could have visited with Shem, who was the son of Noah. And anyway, this just really helps. This took me 20 years to put that chart together, and it just gives a perspective on things. And here's another thing that you can gain from this is that when the Lord told Abraham to leave his father and his father's house, did you know that Shem, one of the sons of Noah, was some of those people that were living in Ur of the Chaldees, and he told him to leave and to get away from them? And so this isn't a definitive thing, but it's very possible that Shem, the son of Noah, may not have continued to walk with the Lord, because those are some of the people that God told Abraham to leave. In verse 8, it says, Then Abraham gave up the ghost and died in a good old age, and an old man and full of years, and was gathered unto his people. And so at this time, 175 years old was considered to be an old man in a good old age. Later, when Moses came along, Moses said in Psalms chapter 90 that the days of a man year would be 70 years. And if by reason of strength they lived to be 80 years, that would still be, like the normal life of a person. And so we see that Methuselah lived to be 969 years old before the flood. After the flood, people's lives began to diminish rapidly. I believe a lot of that had to do with the change in the conditions. Some of my friends, Dr. Carl Ball from Glen Rose, Texas, believe that there was a crystalline layer around the earth that shielded some of the harmful sun rays. And then also they believe that the atmospheric pressure was probably twice what it is today. All of these things added together started contributing to the decrease in the lifespan of people. Also, probably the multiplication of sin did that. But in Abraham's days, the lifespan had decreased to 175, and that was considered to be a good old age. Moses lived to be 120 years old, Deuteronomy chapter 34. And so in verse 9 it says, And his sons Isaac and Ishmael buried him in the cave of Machpelah in the field of Ephron, the son of Zohar, the Hittite, which is before Mamre. And so we already dealt with that in a previous chapter, but this is a cave that Abraham bought to be able to bury Sarah, his wife, and so they buried Abraham there. And this shows that Ishmael and Isaac both came together to do this. Now, we know that Ishmael was the father of all the Arabs, and today there's a tremendous hatred between Arabs and Jews. Maybe not all of the individual Arabs and Jews hate each other, but the leaderships in those nations do. There's been a conflict for thousands of years. But this shows that Isaac and Ishmael both came together to bury their father Abraham. So there was still some relationship and at least some civility between them at this time. In verse 10 it says, The field which Abraham purchased of the sons of Heth, there was Abraham buried, and Sarah his wife. And so that dates back to Genesis chapter 23. In verse 11 it says, And it came to pass after the death of Abraham that God blessed his son Isaac, and Isaac dwelt by the well Lahairoi. And this is where Hagar, who was the father of Ishmael, or the mother of Ishmael, encountered the Lord when she was running away from Sarah. This is recorded in Genesis chapter 16, verses 13 and 14. It says, And she called the name of the Lord that spake unto her, Thou God seest me, for she said, Have I also looked here after him that seeth me? Wherefore the well was called Ber Lahairoi. The word Ber means well, Lahairoi, the one who sees me. And so this is where Isaac was dwelling. In verse 12 it says, Now these are the generations of Ishmael, Abraham's son, whom Hagar the Egyptian Sarah's maid bare unto Abraham. And these are the names of the son of Ishmael by their names according to their generations. The firstborn of Ishmael, Nabaoth, and Kedar, and Adhael, and Mibsam. Again, forgive me for pronouncing all of this. But anyway, Ishmael, that name means God will hear. The name Nabaoth means fruitfulness. And Kedar means dusky, of the skin of the tent, like the skin of a tent. His third son, Abel, means disciplined of God. And so we don't have the record to know whether these names were descriptive of something. You know, many times people's names, they may not have been called that during their lifetime, but afterwards, this is the name that was attributed to them because it described their life. So we don't know if these names are descriptive of what happened to these people or not. And again, bear with me, but I'm trying to read through every verse of the Bible, and these are names that are in the Bible. So in verse 14, it says Mishma and Duma and Massa. Mishma meant hearing, Duma meant silence, Masha meant burden. And in verse 15, Hadar and Tema, Jether, Napish, and Kedma. Again, I can't pronounce all these names. One of the names means chamber, another one means desert, another one means encircled, and another one means refreshed and eastward. These are the sons of Ishmael, and these are their names by their towns, by their castles, 12 princes according to their nations. And so Ishmael had 12 sons, and of course there's probably daughters. They don't always list daughters in these genealogies, but he had 12 sons. In contrast to this, Isaac, the one who was blessed of the Lord, only had 2 children, Esau and Jacob. And of course, there could have been daughters, but again, these are the 2 sons. And so the blessed line didn't have as many children as the people that came out of Ishmael. And so there's some lessons that you can learn from this. Just because you're blessed and just because you're chosen of God doesn't mean everything's going to work. And also we'll see in this very chapter that Rebekah was barren for a period of time. And yet she was the one that was chosen by God. We talked about that in the 24th chapter of Genesis, about how Eliezer, the servant, went and found her, and it was totally miraculous the way that God put them together. And yet she was barren for over 20 years. And so you can learn from this that just because you are blessed of the Lord doesn't mean everything is going to work exactly. But Isaac and Rebekah entreated the Lord, and she finally was healed of her barrenness, and she had these twins. So in verse 17 it says, "And these are the years of the life of Ishmael, 137 years, and he gave up the ghost." In contrast to this, Isaac lived to be 180 years old. And so Ishmael died relatively young compared to his half-brother Isaac. And in verse 18, "And they dwelt from Havilah unto Shur, and that is before Egypt, as thou goest towards Assyria, and he died in the presence of all of his brethren." Verse 19, "And these are the generations of Isaac, Abraham's son. Abraham begat Isaac, and Isaac was 40 years old when he took Rebekah to wife, the daughter of Bethuel, the Syrian of Padan Aram, the sister to Laban, the Syrian." And so this is an important verse because it gives us some reference. And again, this age chart that I have, this is one of the things that I look for in there. So at the time that Isaac married, he was 40 years old. That means that Abraham was 140 years old. Abraham lived 35 years after this, and he lived long enough to see the twins born, Esau and Jacob, to Isaac and Rebekah. And again, you don't always get these things if you just read through, but if you'll get this living commentary, I've got all of these things, and I think it really helps put things into perspective. So Abraham was 140 years old when Isaac and Rebekah married. Abraham would have been 160 when Jacob and Esau were born, and Abraham died when the twins were 15 years old. In verse 21, it says, "And Isaac entreated the Lord for his wife because she was barren, and the Lord was entreated of him, and Rebekah, his wife, conceived." You know, this is another thing if you think about it. Sarah, she went, we don't know the exact time that she was married to Abraham, but she was 91 when Isaac was born, and she was barren for probably at least 30 to 50 years. She was barren. Then here comes Rebekah. She was barren for 20 years, and they had to entreat the Lord. And then comes along Rachel and Leah, and Rachel was barren, and she had to entreat the Lord. And so the first 3 women that were, the heirs in this line of the Jews, Abraham, they were all barren, and they had to entreat the Lord. And I think that there's some things that we can learn from that, that again, God has promised in the covenant to Moses. He said that there would not be a single one barren among us, or any that cast their young, talking about a miscarriage. That's one of the blessings that God has given women, is that they would be able to bear children. And yet the first three ladies, Sarah, Rebecca, and Rachel, were unable to have children and had to entreat the Lord. So the things of God don't just automatically come to pass. Sometimes you have to stand and believe for your rights and the things that God has given us. And so in verse 22 it says, and the children struggled together. This is after Rebekah had conceived. The children struggled together within her, and she said, if it be so, why am I thus? And she went to inquire of the Lord. So this is amazing. These twins were fighting even in her womb. And of course, as they were born, they spent the rest of their life fighting each other. In verse 23, and the Lord said unto her, two nations are in thy womb, and two manner of people shall be separated from thy bowels, and the one people shall be stronger than the other people, and the elder shall serve the younger. So this was a direct answer to Rebekah from the Lord about what was going on the inside of her when the twins were still in her womb. Of course, they didn't have sonograms back then. There was no way for her to know this outside of what God spoke to her, but God told her there was twins and that they were going to be two different nations and that the elder would serve the younger. So that was a word from God to Rebekah. And Rebekah shared this with Isaac. And yet Isaac chose Esau because Esau was a man's man, and he was a strong, hairy man. And we'll go on and read some of these things here. And Jacob was kind of a mama's boy. He was a quiet person. He was kind of a meek person. And so Isaac chose Esau over Jacob, and Rebekah chose Jacob because this was a word from God. And many of the problems that they have here, I think, could be traced back to Isaac and Rebekah, the fact that one loved one of their children more than another. That is a recipe for disaster. So there's a lesson to be learned here, that parents should not prefer one child over another, regardless of what the reasons for it are. In verse 24 it says, and when her days to be delivered were fulfilled, behold, they were twins in her womb, and the first came out red all over like a hairy garment, and they called his name Esau. And after that came his brother out, and his hand took hold on Esau's heel, and his name was called Jacob, and Isaac was 80 years old when she bare them. So that means they got married when he was 40. So he was 60 when they were born. That was 20 years with Rebekah being barren. And notice when it says that Jacob came out and grabbed hold of Esau's heel, that's what the word Jacob means. It means supplanter or heel catcher is what the word means. And so Esau means red, but his name later the scriptures say specifically that he was called Esau because of the red pottage that he got from Jacob. There was an instance after they were grown that Esau had been out hunting, and he came and he was so tired and so hungry that he came to Jacob, and Jacob was cooking some stew, some pottage, and Esau said, give me of your pottage because I'm fainting, I'm about to die. And Jacob says, I'll give it to you for your birthright. And so he bought the birthright from Esau for this red pottage, and that's what it's talking about. And in Genesis chapter 32, verse 28, it says, and he said, thy name shall be called no more Jacob. Or excuse me, that's a wrong reference. That's talking about when Jacob's name was changed to Israel. Genesis chapter 32, verse 28, thy name shall be no more called Jacob, but Israel. For as a prince hast thou power with God and with man, and hast prevailed. And so anyway, the word red is referring to the red pottage that he got from Jacob. We'll read that later as we go on through this story. In verse 27, it says, the boys grew, and Esau was a cunning hunter, a man of the field, and Jacob was a plain man and dwelt in the tents. The word plain here was translated from the Hebrew word that means complete, usually morally pious, specifically gentle or dear. The Amplified Bible the American Standard Version, the New International Version, the Message Bible, all translate this word as quiet. So Jacob was a quiet man, or you could say a meek, a gentle person. Esau was a man's man. He was strong. He went out and hunted, and because of that, Isaac loved Esau, and Rebekah loved Jacob, and this set up a lot of competition and problems between the twins. In verse 28, and Isaac loved Esau because he did eat of his venison, but Rebekah loved Jacob. And again, Rebekah had a word from the Lord, but this is not a reason to love one child over the other. I think that Isaac and Rebekah were both at fault with some of the problems that these twins had with each other. In verse 29, and Jacob sowed pottage, and Esau came from the field, and he was faint. And Esau said to Jacob, feed me, I pray thee, with that same red pottage, for I am faint. Therefore was his name called Edom. So this is the reason that his name, Edom, means red, and it was referring to that pottage. And so let me just make this point that, from that time on, Esau was called Edom. Later on, the Edomites were his descendants, and they dwelt in the area that Petra was one of their main cities that they had way down south of the Dead Sea, actually on the Gulf of Aqaba down there. But his name forever became associated with that red pottage that he had eaten. And let me just point this out. One of the things that I want to do as we go verse by verse through this is not just read these things and talk about what happened thousands of years ago, but make applications to us today. So you need to think about this. Esau, because he was hungry and faint, and he said he was ready to die, but I don't believe that he was to the point of actually physically dying. He probably just felt that hungry, and he despised his birthright. Matter of fact, that was actually said later. Here it is, Hebrews chapter 12, lest there be any fornicator or profane person as Esau, who for one morsel of meat sold his birthright. And it calls him a profane person. And in another passage of Scripture, it talks about how he despised his birthright. And because of that, he was forever called Edom, which meant red, referring to that pottage. So you need to think about this, that in your times of weakness, when you're under a great test, and he was really hungry and stuff, he made a decision that forever changed his destiny. And here we are over 4,000 years later, talking about Esau or Edom, referring to when he despised his birthright, how he sold his birthright, sold his future for just one little bowl of red pottage. If he would have thought, and if he would have known that 4,000 years later, people are going to be talking about him and he's going to become infamous because of a decision that he made in a moment of weakness, he probably wouldn't have done this. And likewise, if we were to sit and think about our decisions, I have learned that sin is never smart. Sin is emotional. We make it based on just the weirdest criteria. But when you're under pressure and you're being pressured to do something and to compromise, you need to think about Esau right here and recognize that his name was called Edom because of one moment of weakness, and he despised his birthright. And for thousands of years, he's been associated with failure and with being profane and all of these kind of things. Of course, the name Benedict Arnold to Americans, it's the same thing. Benedict Arnold was one of the generals of George Washington. He won a great victory up fighting in Canada, and he really had a lot of things going for him, but because he was passed over by George Washington and wasn't given a promotion, he just rebelled. He tried to sell West Point to the British and also tried to capture George Washington, and his treachery was made known. And to this day, the name Benedict Arnold is synonymous with treachery, with treason. The name Mud, when you say somebody's name is Mud, that's a guy that participated in the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. And he was the doctor who treated John Wilkes Booth. And so his name, Mud, it used to be revered as a well-known physician and stuff, but because of his association in helping John Wilkes Booth, his name is Mud to this day. So anyway, you need to think about things like this. Again, this is just a passing reference, and some people read over this, but you need to learn from this. 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verses 6 through 11 says all of these things that were written for our benefit so that we can learn through them, not to lust, not to make these mistakes. So you could learn from Esau right here that here he was despising his birthright just based on a momentary thing. He was hungry. I don't believe he was dying, but he was hungry, and to satisfy his own lust, he was willing to sell his birthright. The firstborn got twice the inheritance as the secondborn son and had all kinds of benefits, and he threw all of that away just for a bowl of pottage. What would Satan like us to do just to satisfy a momentary thing? We need to think about this and take a lesson from Esau. And so in verse 31, and Jacob said, "Sell me this day thy birthright." And Esau said, "Behold, I am at the point to die, and what profit shall this birthright do to me?" Again, I don't believe he was that faint, or he couldn't have made it that far. Now, there's no doubt he was hungry, but I think he exaggerated, and he just despised his birthright, is what it says. And so in verse 33, and Jacob said, "Swear to me this day." And he sware unto him, and he sold his birthright unto Jacob. You know, there isn't any mention that they signed any kind of paper or anything. This goes back to the days when a person, if they said something, they were held by their words. Would to God we could go back to those days. In verse 34 it says, "Then Jacob gave Esau bread and pottage of lentils, and he did eat and drink, and rose up and went his way. Thus Esau despised his birthright." And in going back to Hebrews chapter 12 and verse 16, it says, "Lest there be any fornicator or profane person as Esau, who for one morsel of meat sold his birthright. For you know how that afterward, when he would have inherited the blessing, he was rejected, for he found no place of repentance, though he sought it carefully with tears." And this is referring to Genesis chapter 27, where Jacob not only sold or stole the birthright from Esau, but then he also stole his blessing. That's recorded in Genesis chapter 27. And Esau literally lifted up his voice and wept and cried and begged his father to bless him. But his father had already blessed Jacob, and there just wasn't anything left to do. And so this is saying, use Esau as an example. Don't compromise. Compromise is a language of the devil. You know, I had a situation one time, this is back in the beginning of our ministry, and our income probably was, I'm guessing, I don't remember the exact thing, but I bet you we were probably $25,000 or $30,000 a year is all we got. Maybe $2,000 or $3,000 a month would have been our total income at this time. And I had some people come to me, and they guaranteed that if I would let them write a letter and send it out to my mailing list, that they would guarantee me $1 million in response off of this letter. And man, I needed the $1 million, and so I said, "Come on." And anyway, they showed me this stuff, and I said, "Well, that's not true. I'm not going to do that." They were telling me, they said I'll put pictures of babies in Africa with swollen bellies and flies crawling on them, and this will cause people to give. And they said, "We can raise you $1 million." And I said, "But I don't have an orphanage like they were presenting in this letter." And I said, "I don't do these things. I haven't done all of this humanitarian work that you're talking about." And they said they just raised $22 million for a man who's now gone on to be with the Lord. And they sent out a letter, and they said, we put these things in there, and he didn't have an orphanage either. And he says, but he raised $22 million off of the letter. And he says, it doesn't matter how you get it. You can do with it whatever you want to, but we're just telling you we could raise this money for you. And I kicked him out. And I said, man, I'm not going to do that. I said, that's deception. That's bearing false witness. That's a lie. I'm not going to treat my partners that way. I'm not going to manipulate them. And my point in bringing that up is that, see, during a moment of weakness, we desperately needed the $1 million. I was frustrated, and at that time we were having bill collectors come after us. We were struggling to meet our needs. And some people would have said, but you know, it doesn't matter what you have to do to get the money, just get it and then you can use it any way you want to. But I've learned that whatever you compromise to get, you're eventually going to lose. You can't do things like that. And I learned things like that through Esau right here. Esau, in a moment of weakness, gave away his birthright, and it caused tremendous problems in his life. And he eventually had to flee the land and go live down there way south of the nation of Israel. And he inhabited that land around Petra and stuff. And all of this came because he just despised what he had, and he compromised, and he was willing to do whatever it took just to satisfy temporary lust and desires. Boy, you can't do that. You got to be thinking long term. And I know that I'm speaking to some people that you may be in a tight situation and you may be thinking about compromising your faith, but just don't do it. Again, the Lord told me to give away all of my materials, and we have given away hundreds of millions of books, CDs, DVDs, and things like that. And it hadn't always been easy. And I've had people come to me and prophesy and say, if you'd quit giving your things away and if you'd sell it, then you would have all this money come in. But did you know that's just a commitment that I made to the Lord back about 1973. And I've just stuck with it, and it's not been easy. And there's lots of times that I'd like to compromise, but I've just learned that I am not going to compromise for short-term benefit, because in the long term, it'll hurt me. And boy, this is a lesson we need to learn from Esau right here. So that brings us to the end of the 25th chapter. We only have 1,164 more chapters to go to get through the entire Bible.